Jury to join me for this press conference, having as thematic the conclusion of the second session of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, having in mind to speak about the responsibility and complicity of the companies.
It's one of these, isn't it? Yeah, that one.
Please sit down. Non. It's good. C'est bon.
Push.
C'est bon.
Good morning. It is a great privilege for the Russell Tribunal on Palestine to give its ending press conference in the room of Amnesty International. No place is more suited to listen to humanitarian law when it is being violated and when it has to be protected than Amnesty International. I therefore extend our appreciation and gratitude. We will now gather here to listen to the conclusions that have been made after 2 days of intense work. Here we were at the law school and we sat together, listened to witnesses and experts about the complicity of international corporations, public or private, in the violation extended to Palestine by Israel and by the complicit action of international corporations. And I will gratefully turn to my neighbor Michael Mansfield to give you the result of our deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stéphane, and thank you to everyone who's come here this morning. I'm a member of the jury, and you can see our names in front. Not all the jury were able to be here today, so there are obviously some members missing. And what I'm about to read to you will be available instantly I finish, as far as I know, so that you can all have a copy of it, and the full membership of the jury is on the very last sheet. But I'm not going to read that part of this, as it were, judgment out, but it is available. Now, the only other thing I want to mention is that we're obviously happy to take questions, and I unusually have to say, because it's a press conference, journalists come first, so if they could identify themselves, who they work for, and any question they want to ask, we will obviously endeavour to answer it, and then at some stage we'll obviously pass to other members of the audience who've taken the trouble to come. So this is a statement, if you like, and may I also indicate, as it will become clear, the full report and statement is to come. This is, as it were, a snapshot of what is in store. So I will read it fairly slowly because, again, some of the points that are going to arise in this may be new to some of you. and some of you may not have attended all the hearings, or the 2 hearings, either in Barcelona earlier in the year or here in London. This is a public statement of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine following the conclusion of the London session on corporate complicity in Israeli violations of international law. The Russell Tribunal for Palestine in London session took place at the Law Society, which, as some of you know, is in Chancery Lane in central London, on the 20th and the 21st of November this year. Over the past 2 days, the tribunal heard compelling evidence of corporate complicity in Israeli violations of international law relating to the supply of arms, the construction and maintenance of the illegal separation wall, and in establishing, maintaining and providing services, especially financial, to illegal settlements, all of which have occurred in the context of an illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. It's clear from the evidence of witnesses that this conduct is not only morally reprehensible, but also exposes those corporations to legal liability for very serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. What distinguishes the present situation from others in which international action has been called for is that, in this case, both Israel and the corporations that are complicit in Israel's unlawful actions are in clear violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. The first session of the tribunal, held in Barcelona in March 2010, found the European Union and European Union member states complicit in Israel's violation of international law, including the illegal construction of the wall in Palestinian territory, systematic building of illegal, exclusively Jewish settlements on occupied Palestinian territory, the illegal blockade on Gaza, and numerous illegal military operations against Palestinian civilians, particularly during Operation Cast Lead in Gaza between December 2008 and January 2009, which constitute war crimes and/or crimes against humanity. Further, the Russell Tribunal on Palestine notes that the international community is clearly in agreement that Israel is in flagrant disregard of its international obligations, and further notes with deep regret that this is wholly unsatisfactory and unacceptable state of affairs has been allowed to continue. Nonetheless, Israel's continued impunity and disregard of its state's obligations as a member of the United Nations and bound by the UN Charter has set it apart from the rest of the international community. Accordingly, the Russell Tribunal on Palestine draws to the attention of all corporations complicit in Israel's grave violations that their continued business activities place them on the wrong side of international opinion, morality, and the law. This clearly places both Israel and the corporations in a position in which they are undermining the very integrity and credibility of international law and the institutions that underpin it. The main questions the jury considered in London were, firstly, which Israeli violations of international law are corporations complicit in? Secondly, what are the legal consequences of the activities of corporations that aid and abet Israeli violations? What are the remedies, third question, available? And what are the obligations of states in relation to corporate complicity? Accordingly, in answering these questions, the Tribunal's full findings from the London session, which will be available at the beginning of December 2010, will both summarise the key evidence that it heard about corporate complicity and identify specific legal and non-legal consequences and remedies. The Tribunal has noted the failure of states to take appropriate action to put an end to Israel's violations and illegal conduct, despite the requirements of international law, or to hold to account corporate complicity in Israeli actions, which has prompted civil society to step in and take action to bring about policy changes that respect human rights and international humanitarian law. This includes a very wide range of actions in support of the Palestinians' call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, sometimes known by the acronym BDS. Corporations play a very decisive role in enabling Israel to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. These corporate activities can and have been the subject of citizens' movements that the Russell Tribunal in Palestine received evidence about, including boycotts, shareholders holding corporations to account, divestments by pension funds of investments tainted by illegality, and actions that continue to put corporations in the spotlight with the purpose of bringing about change in corporate culture. In the Israeli context, civil society is taking effective action to enforce the law. Therefore, the Russell Tribunal on Palestine calls on states to protect the rights of all those who initiate or take such lawful BDS actions. 12 corporations and the European Union were invited to participate in the London session, but all declined. Letters were received from 3 corporations and the European Union, which were entered into evidence. They will be annexed to the Tribunal's final conclusions of the London session. Now, the Russell Tribunal on Palestine's conclusions include its findings as to the potential legal liability of several corporations, including the following. So we specify 4. Again, I'll go slowly. Firstly, or A, G4S, a multinational British-Danish corporation, supplies scanning equipment and full body scanners to several military checkpoints in the West Bank, all of which have been built as part of the separation wall, whose route was declared illegal by the ICJ, that's the International Court of Justice in The Hague, in its advisory opinion of the 9th of July 2004. And I have brought it, so if anybody wants to ask about it, I have the opinion with me. Secondly, Elbit Systems, a leading Israeli multinational, has an intimate and collaborative relationship with the Israeli military in developing weapons technology first used by the Israeli army in its active combat operations before marketing and selling the technology to countries worldwide. For example, Elbit supplied unmanned aerial vehicles, otherwise known as drones, sometimes UAVs, that were extensively and illegally used in the Gaza conflict. Despite this, the British Army has recently awarded Elbit a joint contract worth over $1 billion for the development of the next generation of UAVs known as the Watchkeeper program. The British corporation UAV Engines Limited is a wholly owned Elbit subsidiary, will produce the plane's engines. A serious concern regarding the use of drones relates to their indiscriminate nature. This is illustrated by the fact that during the Gaza conflict, for every alleged combatant targeted by drones, there were 10 civilian deaths. The Norwegian pension fund divested from Elbit systems as a result of this complicity in human rights violations. Third company, Caterpillar, based in the United States, supply specifically modified military D9 bulldozers to Israel, which are used in the demolition of Palestinian homes, the construction of settlements and the wall, and in urban warfare in the Gaza conflict, in all cases causing civilian deaths and injuries and extensive property damage not justified by military necessity. Fourth, Cement Roadstone Holdings, an Irish multinational corporation, purchased 25% of the Israeli corporation Mashaf Initiative and Development Limited, which in turn wholly owns Nesha Israel Cement Enterprises Limited, which is Israel's sole cement producer, supplying between 75 and 90% of all cement in Israel and occupied Palestine. This cement is used, amongst other things, for the construction of the illegal separation wall. Next, Dexia, a Franco-Belgian corporation, finances Israeli settlements in the West Bank via its subsidiary, Dexia Israel Public Finance Limited. Next, Veolia Transport, a French corporation, is involved in the construction of the East Jerusalem Light Railway, which Veolia is due to operate. Veolia also operates bus services to illegal Israeli settlements. And finally, and I remind you this is just a selection, Carmel Agrexo is an Israeli corporation, is an exporter of agricultural produce, including oranges, olives, and avocados, from the illegal settlements in the West Bank. The tribunal heard evidence that G4S, Elbit Systems, and Caterpillar, three of the companies I've just mentioned, all acknowledge and actively boast in their promotional material about the use of their equipment during the Gaza conflict, which unlawfully inflicted loss of life and extensive and serious damage on Palestinian civilians and their property. Civil claims against the above corporations brought by victims of their complicity are possible in the countries where those corporations are domiciled or have a significant presence. And corporations and corporate actors, by which it means people who are participating, can be subject to criminal prosecution for breach of domestic law, for example, money laundering and/or concealment, and/or for the commission of international crimes, including the pillage, and I'm just going to insert pillage as a technical term used in English a lot, which simply means the unlawful appropriation of resources, of natural resources. In many countries, domestic law incorporates international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. This is without prejudice to universal jurisdiction or the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. The full conclusion of the Tribunal's London session will provide detailed examples of such potential litigation and also highlight and encourage civil society and BDS actions that can achieve corporate accountability. The tribunal was impressed by the range and depth of the evidence given during the sessions, and the tribunal is extremely grateful for the time, the generosity and the courage of witnesses, particularly those that took part at considerable personal risk. The Russell Tribunal will hold 2 more sessions in the next 2 years. The 3rd session in South Africa will consider the applicability of the crime of apartheid to Israel. After the 4th session, it will publish its full conclusions. The jury of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine was composed, and then I'm not, if you'll forgive me, going to read out all the members on the final page, which should be available any moment now, and the names are in front of you here in any event. Now, may I just pause for breath? Are copies available? They are. Now, I don't know whether you would like to hand them round now, so if people are going to ask questions on what I've read, I read it as slowly as I could without becoming stofily at a standstill. So just 1 second. We'll just can we just pause for breath? We'll hand these out, and then.
I think you might remind them that it's journalists first.
Press.
Yeah, yeah.
Press.
And it's I did say at the beginning, if you wouldn't mind allowing the journalists who've come to go first.
Thank you very much, Michael Mansfield. Let me just add that the full conclusions of our session, London session, should be available within the 10 next days, both in, both in English and in French. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll just pause while, because it's much easier rather than going. And would you be kind enough, members of the press, well, and other individuals, please, to identify who you are by name and the media you represent, in other words, a newspaper or a television channel or whatever it happens to be. We'd be most obliged. I think that's most of them. Just right. Well, I think we've distributed as much as we can, and there's. Sorry if I point. There's a woman in the brown.
Newspaper, The Worker from Denmark.
Right. I'm sorry to do this. Could I ask you to start again? So now you've got the microphone, everybody can hear. Sorry about that.
Britta Bastogi from the newspaper The Worker from Denmark. I would like to know of these findings from the last 2 days and your conclusions, if you're going to ask questions to these corporations which you have found guilty, or which ones and how many, if you are doing it. Thank you.
Well, I think the immediate response to that is partially included in what I've just read out. In other words, the major corporations that were named in evidence, not all of them obviously, because some came up peremptorily and almost without notice. So the ones about whom we knew there was going to be evidence given were all notified in advance. All were asked to participate if they wanted to, and as I read out, none of them wanted to actually participate, but a number of them, 4, did actually provide letters of response, and one in particular, a financial organization, gave a rather more detailed response about what is happening. Now, undoubtedly, I think it is our intention to ensure that the very same corporations that have been named will obviously receive the full findings, so that they will then be in a position, and certainly in some cases we already have an open channel of communication, to know what their response is to this. And so the short answer to your question is, we will undoubtedly ensure, and we've tried to be as as fair as is humanly possible throughout, that they not only knew in advance, they knew while it was going on, because again it was all being broadcast, and secondly they'll know at the end. And we will keep that dialogue open. Sorry, well, I'm trying to do it. There's the woman here, then I'll come up the back, and then there.
Hello, Farina Alam from Press TV. What did the jury do to ensure impartiality in the 2 days that you met? And secondly, who is in a position to do something with your conclusions that is eventually legally binding on the people who are involved or corporations that are involved?
Okay, well, two questions to ensure impartiality. Well, the object of the exercise, as you obviously gather, but may I just re-emphasize what the object of the exercise was? It's twofold. One is to raise awareness, and secondly, having raised awareness, the awareness concerns a legal framework. And the impartiality is with regard to the legal framework, which is why, obviously, I'm on the jury, but there are other lawyers on the jury as well, one of whom is not here at the moment. He's in court himself. And the object, therefore, of having lawyers present on the jury and to, as it were, construct a tribunal which is held in public, which is transparent in terms of the materials that are being looked at and being questioned in public, is that everyone can come if they wish or read the results of the questioning. So there is, I'm not suggesting for a moment, it's the same as a public inquiry in the United Kingdom or an inquest in the United Kingdom, with which I'm very familiar, which have rules of procedure and so on. We're quasi-judicial in that sense, and that we've attempted, by giving due notice and attending with due diligence to what is being said, and giving everyone an opportunity to be heard, to give the semblance of a judicial inquiry, but we can't pretend to be a judicial inquiry, but we are, as it were, impartially attempting to resurrect, effectively, the international legal framework, which has been essentially marginalized and sidelined by both corporations and governments, and as we saw in the first session in Barcelona, the European Union and European states within the Union. So that's the first answer to the answer to the first part of the question. Second part of the question is essentially how, and this is the big question, and everybody wants to know, essentially everybody seems to know and is aware and agreed there are Israeli war crimes and violations and so forth. The big question is, what is anybody going to do about it? Now we are, just to remind you, in a sense, a result of civil society demanding answers. So what we're trying to do is to provide a framework within which hopefully governments might be persuaded, but we live in hope, governments might be persuaded, corporations might be persuaded to change their policy, and one of the letters that we received indicated that they were prepared to change policy. And finally, and it is finally, the law is a final resort. One hopes one doesn't have to do it by the law, but one's saying to individuals, particularly those who are on the receiving end of this complicity, those in the occupied territories, but obviously there are people outside, but people within the occupied territories, can begin to see that there are possible avenues, either for prosecution of international crime, at the various levels that we've indicated, international and domestic, or the possibility of civil suits being brought against the companies wherever their domicile will have a significant presence, if we put it. So it's awareness, on the one hand, raising the awareness of the connections and the possibilities, and empowerment in actually saying, all right, you don't have to sit by and wait. You can initiate methods of legal redress, which will hopefully, as I say, highlight what is possible and cause corporations in this instance to think twice about what they're doing. So I hope that answers that question. Sorry, I'm not going to monopolise all the questions or the answers, so I'm going to spread it out. If anybody else, any other juror wishes to answer.
Only to answer to the question from Britta Bastogi is that the organizing committee will send this conclusion not only to the corporate, but also to the international institution like UNCTAD, the WTO, the ONUD and the UN, that we will send it to also to the government and parliaments, because they have also their own responsibility in their relation and the subsidy that they give to some of the corporate, to the trade union and to the consumers organization.
There's a gentleman with a white shirt. Yeah, I think on the left-hand side, sorry, a bit blinded by the light, as they say, but...
Can I ask, what considerations...
Before you start, sorry.
Sorry, Richard Millett.
Yeah, and media?
I'm probably one of the only opposing voices that you might have had or heard at the weekend.
Sorry, are you a member of the media?
Yes,
right,
but my own media.
Yeah, what's that called?
Well, I'm just a freelance.
Freelance media?
Journalist, yeah.
Okay.
What considerations did...
Richard, did I catch the name? I'm sorry.
Millett.
Millett, okay.
I think there's another barrister by the same name as me. And what considerations did Israel's security considerations play during your deliberations? I understand that you're calling Israel's actions illegal. We know that there were reasons for said occupation, for the wall that has been built. These things go back a long way, starting in 1967. And we know that people were regularly walking into Israeli restaurants and blowing up innocent Israeli citizens. And surely, in the law, one of the main defences is that of self-defence. And number two, when will you be having a similar tribunal in relation to other conflicts and other occupations that are going on around the world, or are you just sticking purely to Israel?
Right, Richard, thank you. I'll kick off the answers, but others may join in, obviously. Firstly, I'm very grateful for your invitation to address other occupations that are oppressive and illegal throughout the world, because in fact the history of the Russell Tribunal has been to look at precisely unlawful situations that have arisen. And Bertrand Russell, who was effectively the mentor for the whole of this, started by looking at the American actions in the Vietnam War, but it's also looked at oppression and repressive regimes in South America. So Palestine just happens to be in a series, and no doubt, given the opportunity and the resources in future, I speak only for myself, I'd be more than willing to go into other areas. So you're quite right about that. Now, to answer your first question, which is a very important question, and I've been involved in a large number of cases in which this issue arises, and I've been to Palestine. I am aware of security, just as I am aware for my own personal security, right here in London, and as most Londoners are. So we're all very aware of security. So the philosophical, if you like, and jurisprudential answer to this is, how do you achieve security for individuals? That's the key question, and you're nodding, so I think you agree. How do you achieve security? We absolutely did take it on board, because, of course, at the end of the day, the security of Israel and of people who live within Israel is dependent upon a certain recognition of the Palestinians and the Palestinian state. So that is, as a political statement, extremely important. Now, I'm not going into whether it's one state, two states, or any of the other solutions at the moment. I'm just dealing with recognition of rights. Now, that's what we've tried to establish here. And interestingly, the point you make, and I'm going to resist reading it out because I've read it out so many times. I brought the advisory court judgment from the ICJ. It is, in fact, possibly the most important international court in the world, and has a long history going back Beyond the United Nations, back to the League of Nations, it's an international court with considerable reputation. And there were 14 judges of considerable experience and expertise sitting on this. And the question they were being asked to consider by the United Nations on our behalf to consider was whether the separation wall was lawfully constructed. Now, as an entity, not just the fact of the wall, but the repercussions of the wall on the environment through which it travels, and perhaps I don't need to spell it out geographically. Now, what the court did on this occasion, the reason I feel it's important to address your question is, they did precisely what you wanted them to do. They absolutely did address the question of security, because the argument that was raised in the case of the wall was that one. It was the reduction, it was said, of terrorism, people going through and so on. So it was addressing that exact point. And what the court found was that, in fact, there was the building of a wall in the way it was carried out was totally disproportionate to the, as it were, the needs and demands on the ground. So they took security into account, but they said it was not justified by that particular argument. So it's not as though we just trample all over, you know, Israeli identity or security any more than the court did. We don't do that. We take it into account. And every single international tribunal is constantly having to balance two things. As we in London are having to do now, that's the question that's just come up, in terms of civil rights and terrorism. Which is going to be the most important? And that's the balance that's constantly being struck. And interestingly, in this country, just for a moment, that balance by the coalition is actually not towards increasing custody, but decreasing custody. I just give it as an illustration. In other words, security cannot always be the determining factor, but it obviously is a factor. So my answer to your question is, we considered it. Now I open it up to anyone else. All right, the next question. Yes, there's a gentleman up the steps on the right.
My name is Ali Bahajoub. I'm representing North-South Publications. You mentioned that you're going to have a third session in South Africa. Is it going to take the same format? And are you going to look at the corporate side of it? And also you mentioned a fourth session. Where is that going to be? And is it going to be on the same subject? Thank you.
I'm going to, yeah, I've got some answers, but Stéphane, I think, I'm so sorry, Pierre.
Well, you know that Tribunal Russell on Palestine is under the responsibility of an international committee, organizing committee. And the international organizing committee have taken the decision to make 4 sessions. One was in Barcelona, the next one is here, the next would be in South Africa, and the last one would be in America, North America. So now how to build the session itself, it's the responsibility of the international committee, and let us take the time that we need to do that and to have the good relation with our partner in South Africa, to have the dialogue and to construct this next session in time, and it will happen next year, during the year, okay?
Will you allow me to say
Stéphane,
a few minutes? For the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, the most important objective that we want to achieve is that public opinion everywhere is conscious of what needs to be done. Therefore, we are bound by the acceptance of our message by the media, and I call on journalists, television, radio, and other media to take account of what is needed. We are in no way unfair to the population of Israel. We consider it, most of us, as a country with a great and important past. We also know that it has been created in order to make an answer to one of the most horrible crimes that have been exercised in the 20th century, the extermination of European Jews. Therefore, we wish all the best to the inhabitants of the country of Israel, that they may find their way to accept international law, members as they are of the United Nations, knowledgeable of the values of its charter. It would be for us the greatest relief to find an Israel which would live up to its potential. And we are very unhappy to note that the present government of Israel is not going in that direction, and that is the only reason why we think it is important, essential, to raise the question of violations of international law in a way to make it gradually possible for international law to prevail everywhere, including, of course, in Israel. Thank you.
The press conference, please.
Yeah.
It's not a public debate, it's a press conference. Don't applaud, please.
Marin.
I would like to second the last speaker's comments. I think it's very important that we recognize that we are the human family, and we have international laws and domestic laws, and the great body of laws that we have all put in place are to protect every single individual. And it is to our great peril that we would allow these laws to be dissolved or ignored. We have responsibility wherever we live to stand up for human rights, for international laws, for human dignity. We all participate in different tribunals. I'm a member of the tribunal which took place in New York on Burma just a few months ago. There are many tribunals where people come together to say that international law and human rights are important, and that is why we're here. We're here because we care and love the people of Israel and Palestine. And we're here because we see that they are caught in history of violence and more violence, and somehow we believe that by returning to international law and human rights, that the problems of Israel and Palestine can be solved. We have come here to say that Israel is committing war crimes and abusing and ignoring international laws. That is not acceptable. It is a member of the international community, and it has responsibility to uphold these laws. But other people assist the like of occupations such as happens in Palestine, and that's corporations, multinationals and others. And they have responsibility. So we have concluded that there are corporations who are complicit with the Israeli breaking of international laws, and they are therefore acting criminally and must be held legally accountable. So that is why we have supported the BDS campaigns and the campaigns which will say to corporations that you have to uphold domestic law, you have to uphold international law. There's a very important section in our report which says that we support the civil community in its actions to make corporations accountable, to make states accountable, to uphold international law and human rights. And when you ask the sister in the front here who carries forward this report, I say we all carry forward this report. Every single individual who's concerned for the suffering in Palestine and in Israel can take action. Ordinary civil community can work to bring about real justice and real change in Israel and Palestine, which is what we all want to see. So the civil community acting together as much as possible to make Israel accountable under international law will bring about real change. So we all are involved in this. And I think one thing we can all agree, in the last 2 days, we were very inspired and impressed by the human rights groups, the civil rights groups who came to give us testimony from Israel and Palestine as to what is happening there, which is an abuse of human rights. We applaud their courage and their work in these communities, and we recognise their work as being legal because they are the ones who are really challenging the governments and the corporations to uphold human rights and international laws.
Gentleman up the...
Ali Bahajub, North-South Publications. Journalistic inquisition l'oblige. And I was wondering, actually, you mentioned in your introduction that you invited 12 corporates plus the European Union. Was Israel actually invited to participate? The second one is the 3 corporates that you mentioned who responded in writing, were they permitted to actually be represented during the proceedings? Thank you.
I can answer a bit of it, then I'll ask Pierre to follow through. All the corporations that were specified, that's the 12, that we knew we had material about, were all written to on the basis that they could come, participate, if you like, be represented. I mean, nobody was represented, but they could be there, or they could have someone to represent them instead. They could send an agent, obviously, along to present their case, or present observations, whatever they like. That was open to them. None of them, they all made it clear they didn't wish to actually participate in that sense. Some didn't reply at all. But the ones that did reply said they didn't wish to participate in the sense of coming, but they were giving a response. I mean, I'll just give you one example was, well, basically, this is such a sensitive, highly sensitive time in Middle East negotiations and so on, that they felt it wouldn't be right for them to provide a response. I'm putting it in short form. But, and another company I've already mentioned actually gave a very detailed response and indicated a change of policy. So that was interesting. The ones that didn't reply, we don't know. They have often not ignored approaches in the past from the civil society groups, the BDS groups. They have often ignored them and just carried on. So I don't know what their position is. Now, so far as Israel is concerned, in terms of a formal invitation to them, Pierre, I don't know what you may want to say on that.
Yes, when we start with this initiative and we received the support of the Russell Foundation, we start from a month later after the advice of the ICG and the General Assembly resolution on the wall. And at this time, Israel was present in this ICG, like the Palestinian authorities, they were appealed to go there. And we start from the conclusion of this ICG advice. We don't need to go back and to analyze if there are crimes committed by Israel. It was well present in the report of the ICG.
I think it's a slightly different question. I think you're asking whether they were invited.
Yes, yes, yeah. But I will come to that.
Okay.
So we don't need to invite Israel because our purpose was not to examine the crime made by Israel. Our purpose was to analyze the complicity of first session in Barcelona of the European Union and the state of the European Union. During this session, it was to analyze the complicity of the corporate. So there was not a need to invite or the Israeli government or the Palestinian authorities. That was not the purpose of the session. If at one moment the purpose of the session would be the crime of Israel or the crime committed by the Palestinian authorities during the Gaza war, And maybe we can ask them to come to the tribunal. But it was not the time now, okay?
I mean, I think as a footnote, we may have to, I'm speaking straight off the top of my head, so you have to put that in parentheses. But I think on the next stage, where one's dealing with whether or not the way in which the Israeli authorities treat Palestinians within the occupied territories and elsewhere constitutes the crime of apartheid, that might be an occasion on which it would be fair to say to the Israeli authorities, we are considering this, we would like your observations on whether you think that that is what is happening. Given Israeli history, Jewish history, I think they may have a considerable amount to contribute to that debate. So therefore, the answer to your question is the one that's just been given, but for the future, particularly in the next session, I think we will have to seriously consider that.
Right. Quite right.
Any other questions? Sorry, I can't see that side of the audience. So if there's somebody behind the light, I can't see.
There's a lady on the left.
If you just stand up and be... Yes, I'm sorry, I can't see. Yes.
Okay, my name is Sophia McLeod from the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Could I ask Ronnie Casrels and also John Dugard of South Africa, given your own experiences of the anti-apartheid struggle, what your thoughts are on the significance of these sessions, the Russell Tribunal on Palestine?
Well, we are not dealing with the issue of... we're not dealing at this stage with the issue of whether the occupation constitutes the crime of apartheid. I think it's important to draw parallels between the South African experience and the present situation in Israel-Palestine. And I think it's very important to stress that during the anti-apartheid era, when there was great pressure upon corporations to disinvest from South Africa, there was no clear illegality on the part of the South African government. International law had not evolved as far as it has today, and so there was still a debate about whether apartheid constituted a crime against humanity. And so corporations argued that trading with South Africa, doing business in South Africa, was not illegal. The situation is very, very different in respect of Israel, because it's important to stress that the International Court of Justice, the Security Council, General Assembly, Human Rights Council, and other intergovernmental institutions, as well as non-governmental institutions, have all found Israel's conduct to be in violation of international law. And so what we did in this session was to indicate the complicity of corporations, both Israeli and multinational corporations, in Israel's crimes. And I think I cannot stress enough that here we are dealing with a criminal enterprise on the part of Israel, criminal under international law and in many cases under national legal systems. And there is an obligation on the part of states to redress such illegality, but if states do not take action, there's also responsibility on the part of corporations and civil society to redress these wrongs. Thank you.
I'll just add on that particular aspect of the mobilization of popular support for a just cause, as was the case with the anti-apartheid movement, which helped to isolate South Africa and bring about that situation over 30 years from when the boycott call was first sounded here in London, in fact, in 1959. It took 30 years building up the steam, building up the support worldwide amongst civil society, because in the Western countries, as is the case with Israel, these were the pillars of support for apartheid South Africa. And we had to look to popular support of the people, the churches, the trade unions, the youth, the women groups, and so on. And I think everybody knows that story. So in relation to civil society, in this particular just cause, and incidentally, as I think has been referred to already by Stéphane, it's not something that's anti a particular people, it's anti a system. So we used to see in South Africa that that particular groundswell internationally would even get through to the minority white people in South Africa, which it did to a certain degree, as we see now this call getting through to public opinion in Israel, amongst Jews in Israel, and amongst Jews around the world, a very important aspect, but part of the internationalism that is taking place. And we South Africans cannot underestimate the importance of the BDS and the kind of input we've heard, the role of the tribunal in saying that civil society has this very, very important role to play. And of course, including, as we did with the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa, to bring pressure on the governments that allow Israel the impunity to carry on its absolute criminal activity. And incidentally, I say to that gentleman, the Zionist, we see it in a total context of perpetrators and victims. And that's been the case in Israel, Palestine, from the dispossession of the Palestinian people in 1948.
There's a gentleman right at the back.
Hi. Robert Logan from the arts and political journal Topical Fish. I just wanted to ask, do you think the findings have any ramifications for those engaging in civil disobedience as a means to highlight corporate complicity and promote the BDS campaign?
Yes, I can answer that one directly. The answer is yes. And in fact, we heard from a lawyer who had been involved in two actions where there were criminal prosecutions, and he represented those who had actively protested in relation to two different companies, one in Northern Ireland and one not, one in England. And the position is very important, and it stems again not only from the advisory opinion, but it is there in the advisory opinion, because what the advisory opinion is saying to governments and everyone, we all have an obligation to bring, if you like, the wall and the settlements, but the wall to an end. Which means that those who wish to, as it were, actively protest in relation to that, here in this country or in Northern Ireland, limited for time, the usual problem, wish to protest about that, are entitled, if and when, not always prosecuted, if the prosecuting authority decides that they are, for criminal damage, whatever it happens to be, they're going to prosecute the individuals who've entered offices or whatever it is, then the individuals who are prosecuted have a defense, sometimes called necessity, in which they are saying there is a greater good. Yes, there's damage, but the damage was done as of necessity to prevent a greater evil being caused. So actually what BDS, but it wasn't a BDS solely devoted to them, but if people, as it seemed to us through this witness, come and tell us that is exactly what is being successful, and juries, that's the interesting thing, courts in the United Kingdom, juries, ordinary people in the United Kingdom, it's the democratic aspect of our system, are saying, we find you not guilty because of the greater good. So it's extremely important that it's a two-pronged thing. One is proactive, in other words, actually going to governments and corporations. The other is reactive. If we get accused, then we have a perfectly legitimate defense. And may I just add as a footnote on this, I know the time is restricted. What we are equally horrified to note is that the Israeli government is currently considering making protest and objection along these lines a criminal offence. So therefore, this is, as I see it, a totally oppressive situation, in as much as you're not going to even be allowed to speak out against it. Does anybody else want to add? Very good.
I think the people movement here is very important, and the movement for civil disobedience and for non-violent peace protests is so urgent. What we're seeing in Palestine, which gives us all great hope, is the growth of the non-violent movement in the villages. And together, if you go to Bilan and places like that, you meet Israeli peace activists who very courageously going into the West Bank. You meet the Palestinians who are really, really organising, and internationals. And this is where the hope comes from, and this is where the change will really come from. But tragically, what is also happening is that there's more and more repression by the Israeli government and the Israeli military. And what they're doing is they're continuing to lift out of the villages the non-violent leaders. I mean, in Bilan now, one of the great leaders there, Abu Rahmed, is currently been lifted and is in prison, and all he had ever done was non-violently organise the villagers to work to stop the wall. So I think we have to recognise that it will be the civil community, it will be determined action done non-violently, whether you live in Bilan or Berlin or Belfast. We have to organise non-violently to challenge these unjust laws that Israel is applying. So, and we're doing it out of conscience, and we're doing it non-violently, and we're doing it because our governments all over the world have not only refused to speak out on behalf of the Palestinian people, but have actually colluded and paid for and underpinned financially, morally, in every way the illegal occupation of the Palestinian people. We all have to speak out against this, and we pay tribute to those who are willing to do non-violent civil disobedience in order to see that the Palestinian people have their human rights, have their dignity, and have the right, as everyone has, to their country.
And can I just add as a footnote, there is a protest, a perfectly lawful, legitimate, non-violent protest going on in London now, today, in relation to a company, Ahava, that you may have heard of, that produces goods that are mislabeled for a start off, but in any event are exploiting natural resources in Israel-Palestine, and is essentially complicit, we will be dealing with it in the full report, complicit in the illegality that we've already talked about. So that, I don't exactly know where it is happening in London, but it is happening now. And thank you very much.
And it is concerned with the sale of so-called Dead Sea products.
Dead Sea products, yes.
No. If there is no.
How are we doing on the time front? Fine. Any more questions?
Last one.
Or a last one? If not, I'll hand back to Pierre or
No, to Stéphane.
Stéphane,
you're the end.
can I just check? No one else?
Yes.
All right. Oh, no, there isn't.
Christian French, yes.
Okay. No, it's not.
I hope nobody is frustrated. It is not always easy to assist a long session with long papers being read out, even if they are read out by the beautiful voice and strong accent of my friend and neighbor. But let me say that since we are now concluding this press conference, it is really for you, members of the press, for you, citizens of London, to continue to bear the burden of trying to make illegal situations done with, and to have peace, justice, values that are shared by all of us be the result of your everyday labor. Thanks again, Amnesty International, to to whom we all owe a debt of gratitude. And let me tell you that it was for me personally a great pleasure to work with this particular jury under the leadership of our coordinator, Pierre Galland, and to spend these 2 days having the feeling that we have put our fingers on something that can and must continue to be borne by all of us in order to change what is unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can we
Thank you very much.
Action of international corporations. And I will gratefully turn to my neighbor Michael Mansfield to give you the result of our deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stéphane, and thank you to everyone who's come here this morning. I'm a member of the jury, and you can see our names in front. Not all the jury were able to be here today, so there are obviously some members missing. And what I'm about to read to you will be available instantly I finish, as far as I know, so that you can all have a copy of it. And the full membership of the jury is on the very last sheet. But I'm not going to read that part of this, as it were, judgment out, but it is available. Now, the only other thing I want to mention is that we're obviously happy to take questions, and I unusually have to say, because it's a press conference, journalists come first, so if they could identify themselves, who they work for, and any question they want to ask, we will obviously endeavour to answer it, and then at some stage, we'll obviously pass to other members of the audience who've taken the trouble to come. So this is a statement, if you like, and may I also indicate, as it will become clear, the full report. And
No, it's clear. C'est bon, c'est bon.
Push.
C'est bon, c'est bon.
Good morning. It is a great privilege for the Russell Tribunal on Palestine to give its ending press conference in the room of Amnesty International. No place is more suited to listen to humanitarian law when it is being violated and when it has to be protected than Amnesty International. I therefore extend our appreciation and gratitude. We will now gather here to listen to the conclusions that have been made after 2 days of intense work. Here we were at the law school and we sat together, listened to witnesses and experts about the complicity of international corporations, public or private, in the violation extended to Palestine by Israel and by the complicit
jury to join me for this press conference, having as thematic the conclusion of the second session of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, having in mind to speak about the responsibility and complicity of the companies. Please sit down.
Statement is to come. This is, as it were, a snapshot of what is in store. So I will read it fairly slowly because, again, some of the points that are going to arise in this may be new to some of you. And some of you may not have attended all the hearings, or the 2 hearings, either in Barcelona earlier in the year or here in London. This is a public statement of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine following the conclusion of the London session on corporate complicity in Israeli violations of international law. The Russell Tribunal for Palestine in London session took place at the Law Society, which, as some of you know, is in Chancery Lane in central London, on the 20th and the 21st of November this year. Over the past 2 days, the tribunal heard compelling evidence of corporate complicity in Israeli violations of international law relating to the supply of arms, the construction and maintenance of the illegal separation wall, and in establishing, maintaining and providing services, especially financial, to illegal settlements, all of which have occurred in the context of an illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. It's clear from the evidence of witnesses that this conduct is not only morally reprehensible, but also exposes those corporations to legal liability for very serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. What distinguishes the present situation from others in which international action has been called for is that, in this case, both Israel and the corporations that are complicit in Israel's unlawful actions are in clear violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. The first session of the tribunal, held in Barcelona in March 2010, found the European Union and European Union member states complicit in Israel's violation of international law, including the illegal construction of the wall in Palestinian territory, systematic building of illegal, exclusively Jewish settlements on occupied Palestinian territory, the